Part 1. The Last Goodbye. It was a quiet morning in a small town nestled amidst hills and dense forests, a place where everyone knew each other, and the air always seemed to carry a sense of peace. The town square, a simple but beautiful area with cobbled streets and small cafes, was oddly silent on that fateful day, the kind of silence that hints at something sinister lurking just beyond the reach of ordinary life. Elena, a young woman in her early 20s, walked down the path that led to her childhood home, her heart heavy with sorrow. Her mother, Maria, had been sick for months, suffering from a rare illness that no doctor could quite explain. It had taken her slowly, each day worse than the last, until finally, the inevitable had happened. The day before, Maria had passed away in her sleep, a peaceful end to a battle she had fought with grace. Though the family knew her suffering had been unbearable, the funeral was planned quickly. People in the town knew Maria well. She was beloved for her kindness, her generosity, and the way she always had a smile, even when things weren't going well. And so, the small chapel at the edge of town was filled with friends, family, and acquaintances who had come to say their final goodbye. Elena had been holding it together in the days leading up to the funeral, but as she stood at the door of the chapel now, she could feel the tears welling up. Her mother's coffin, sitting at the front of the room, was so starkly final. She could see the intricate carvings on the wooden casket, the floral arrangements surrounding it, and the light filtering through the stained glass windows. Everything about this moment felt surreal, like an unpleasant dream that refused to end. She took a deep breath and stepped inside, her footsteps echoing in the vast, quiet room. The weight of the room seemed to press down on her, the sorrow and the grief of so many people hanging in the air. The faces around her were blurred, but she could hear whispers. Words of comfort, of condolences, of shared grief, but none of it seemed to reach her. Elena felt as though she were underwater, everything distant, muffled, and uncertain. Her eyes instinctively found the coffin. It looked so cold, so final. There, her mother lay, dressed in the white dress she had always admired on her. Maria's hands were folded gently over her chest, her face pale but peaceful, a faint smile still lingering on her lips as though she were simply resting. Elena's heart twisted painfully as she took in the sight, but she forced herself to approach. She needed to see her mother one last time. She needed to say goodbye. The others in the chapel continued their quiet conversations, their voices blending together. Elena walked slowly toward the coffin, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the tears threatening to spill, but she held them in check. Determined not to fall apart completely, she stood at the side of the coffin, staring down at her mother, willing herself to accept the reality of the situation. "I love you, Mama," she whispered softly, leaning in closer. "I hope you're at peace now." But as she gazed at her mother's face, something unusual caught her eye, a slight movement. At first, she thought it was nothing. The wind, perhaps, or maybe even a trick of the light. But then she saw it again, a subtle, almost imperceptible twitch of her mother's fingers. Her breath caught in her throat. No, it couldn't be. Her mind raced, confusion and disbelief flooding her thoughts. Maria had been dead for over 24 hours. She had been lying in this coffin, untouched, prepared for burial. Elena stepped closer, almost afraid to move. She stared at her mother's face, wondering if she had imagined the movement. But then it happened again. The fingers twitched, ever so slightly. Elena's heart pounded in her chest as she took a step back, her mind struggling to process the impossible. Was it possible? Was her mother still alive? No, it couldn't be. But she couldn't shake the growing sense of panic, the strange feeling that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end after all. Without thinking, Elena reached for the lid of the coffin. Her hands shook as she gripped the edges of the wooden casket, her breath quickening. She had to know. She couldn't stand not knowing. Not after everything. She couldn't leave here with this uncertainty gnawing at her. She slowly lifted the lid, her body trembling with dread. The room seemed to grow quieter, as if the very air held its breath in anticipation of what she would discover. Elena peeked inside, half expecting the worst. But then she saw it. The faintest of movements. Her mother's chest rose, and then it fell. Her mother was alive. Part 2. The shocking discovery. Elena's hands trembled as she stood frozen, staring at her mother's chest. which was now visibly rising and falling with shallow breaths. The world around her seemed to melt away, the muffled sobs and whispers from the chapel fading into an eerie silence. Her entire body shook as she slowly lowered the coffin lid back, trying to make sense of what she had just witnessed. Her mind screamed that this wasn't possible. Maria had been dead for over a day. She had seen the doctors, the ones who confirmed her mother's passing, who signed the death certificate. But here she was, standing before a coffin where her mother's body was moving as if she had just fallen asleep. Elena's first instinct was to scream, to alert everyone around her. But a deep, primal fear held her back. What if she was wrong? What if she had imagined it all? What if this was just a trick of her grief-stricken mind? No, she couldn't be mistaken. She had seen it with her own eyes. Her mother was alive. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she could barely hear her own thoughts. She had to act quickly, she realized. If her mother was alive, if there was even the faintest chance that she had been revived, Elena knew they needed help. Desperately, she reached for the phone in her pocket. But before she could dial, she felt a hand on her shoulder. "Elena?" A soft voice asked, and she turned to find her Aunt Clara standing behind her, her expression filled with concern. "Are you all right, dear? The service will begin soon." Elena's eyes widened, and she instinctively pressed her fingers to her lips. How could she explain this to her aunt? How could she possibly tell anyone that she thought her mother was alive? Before she could speak, Aunt Clara glanced down at the coffin. Aunt Clara's face turned pale, and her lips parted as if she were about to say something but couldn't find the words. Elena's gaze shifted back to the coffin, and the movements were still there. Her mother's chest was still rising and falling, though much slower now, almost imperceptible. "Aunt Clara, she's alive," Elena whispered, her voice barely audible. Clara's eyes widened in disbelief, her breath catching in her throat. Without thinking, she rushed forward, her hands trembling as she lifted the lid completely, revealing Maria's body. The two women stared in shock as they watched her mother's fragile form breathe. "Oh my God, how?" Aunt Clara gasped, her voice thick with disbelief. Elena was too stunned to answer. All she could do was watch as her mother's eyes fluttered open, slowly, weakly, her lips parting in a faint gasp. A low, trembling breath escaped her mouth. And then, for the first time in days, Maria's eyes locked onto Elena's face. "Mom," Elena whispered, her voice breaking. Her mother's lips trembled, as though trying to speak. But no words came out. Elena's heart raced as she leaned closer, her fingers brushing her mother's cold hand, now surprisingly warm to the touch. "Elena," Maria whispered, her voice barely above a breath, but it was enough to shatter the fragile barrier between the world of the living and the dead. Aunt Clara looked over at Elena, her eyes wide in terror. "We need to get her to a doctor now." Without wasting another moment, Elena nodded. Her hands shook violently as she gently cupped her mother's face. Her world had just been turned upside down, and now, with the horror and wonder of this impossible moment, Elena knew she needed answers. The family members who had gathered for the funeral were still outside, unaware of the horrifying, miraculous scene unfolding inside. Elena had no idea how she could explain this to them. How could anyone believe what had just happened? But that didn't matter now. What mattered was getting her mother help. Part 3. The hospital. Minutes later, Elena and Aunt Clara rushed to the hospital, Maria lying unconscious in the back seat. The drive was a blur, but Elena couldn't shake the feeling of dread. Was this a miracle or something more terrifying? The doctors had pronounced Maria dead, but her breathing was undeniable. They arrived at the emergency room, where doctors and nurses rushed to her side, hooking Maria up to machines and calling for immediate tests. Elena stood frozen in the hallway, her mind racing with questions. How could this happen? Could it be some kind of mistake? After what felt like hours, the head doctor emerged, his face pale and grim. "I don't understand what's going on," he said. "We've confirmed it. Your mother is alive, but she's been in some sort of suspended state. Her vitals are stabilizing now, but this doesn't make sense. We need to run more tests." Elena's heart sank. Suspended state. What did that even mean? Was her mother somehow trapped between life and death? As the doctors continued their work, Elena couldn't help but think back to the coffin, to the horrifying yet miraculous discovery. Her mother was alive, but for how long? And what was happening to her? Part 4. The unraveling truth. Over the next few days, Maria slowly regained consciousness. The doctors, baffled and unable to offer concrete answers, simply described her condition as recovery from a near-death event. But Elena wasn't satisfied. She needed to know more. Why had her mother been pronounced dead, only to revive hours later? And why hadn't anyone noticed the signs? The more Elena investigated, the more unsettling things became. There were rumors circulating about a rare condition that could cause a person's vitals to appear to stop, but not truly end. Something about a state of suspended animation. Elena visited several specialists, but none could explain it. Was her mother's case an anomaly, or had something far darker occurred? One night, after another long day of research and visits, Elena found an old journal tucked away in her mother's belongings. It was filled with cryptic entries, something about experiments, secrets buried deep in the family's past. The final page sent chills down her spine. I fear the price of my discovery is greater than I imagined. I cannot escape what I've unleashed. Her heart pounded. What had her mother been involved in? Was this more than just a miracle? Was this something she was never meant to know? Part 5. The final revelation. Weeks passed, and Maria slowly regained her strength. But something was off. She wasn't the same. Her eyes were distant, her words often unclear. The once vibrant woman Elena had known now seemed like a ghost, haunted by something unseen. And then one night, Maria confessed the truth. I wasn't supposed to come back, Maria whispered, her voice trembling. They tried something. It was supposed to be for science, to save lives. But it went wrong, and now I'm paying the price. Elena listened in horror as her mother described a secret experiment involving suspended animation, something her mother had unknowingly become a part of. It was supposed to push the boundaries of science, to preserve life at the brink of death. But it had backfired, and Maria had been caught in the crossfire. With the truth now out in the open, Elena was left with a terrible choice: expose the truth to the world, or protect her mother from the consequences of a dangerous and forbidden discovery. As Elena stood by her mother's side, she realized that the true horror of the situation was not the miraculous return of life, but the knowledge that sometimes the dead should stay buried. The chilling tale leaves viewers with more questions than answers, as Elena's life will never be the same after the discovery. The world of the living and the dead has blurred, and with it, the unsettling truth about the price of tampering with life itself.